first thing we need to do for the sleeveless crop top is to create the ruching effect here. So I've marked the end of the ruching point here with my pin, and we're going to stitch with a long stitch length from here to here. Scrunch the gathering by pulling on the threads until you have it how you like it. Then stitch it down with a regular stitch length. Once you've top stitched it, remove the gathering stitch. Once you've stitched down your ruching, we're going to look at the underbust area. So there should be 2 notches here, and you have a piece of elastic. So the elastic's smaller than the fabric, so we need to stretch it out and pin it in place. So when you take it to the sewing machine, you need to stretch it out as you sew, and we're going to sew it on with a zigzag stitch at the seam allowance area, which is about a 1/2 inch in. Once you have stitched the zigzag along the bottom of both, we're going to take our pieces and put them wrong sides together. We're going to create a French seam, and we're going to do that along the shoulder seams and the right side. The left side we're going to keep open to do a zipper later. So to create a French seam, once you have this pinned together, we're going to sew a straight stitch with a very small seam allowance, about 1/4 inch. Once you've stitched along with a small seam allowance, we're going to flip it over to the other side and then give it a press. Once you press it like this, then we're going to sew the seam allowance again. So we're going to sew about a 1/2 inch here. And the idea for the French seam is that it will catch the seam allowance here, and then it'll just be a really nice finished seam. Now that your bodice is sewn together on the shoulder and the right side, on the left side, so keep that open, we're going to apply bias binding. So I'm just opening up my binding here, and we're going to stitch it down on the right side, right in this crease here. Stitch along here. Press your seam flat. And open it up and press it this way. And you're going to stitch it shut like that along that seam line in here. Once the binding is complete, then make a seam right sides together. Sew it with a long stitch length. Press your seam open and then flip it to the right side. So we're going to take our zipper and we're going to pin it in, being really careful to center it. Check when you pin it on that your zipper teeth are centered in line with the seam right here. Once my zipper is pinned in place on the inside, I like to sew it so that I can see, so that the top is, the right side is facing up. So in order to do that, I need to have the pins on the other side. So I'm just adjusting it this way. You can, if you'd like to, also hand baste it in place if that makes it easier for you too, before you go to top stitch the zipper down next to the teeth. Top stitch your zipper in place with a zipper foot. Make sure that the zipper foot is just on the side of the zipper teeth. Once you've top stitched it on both sides, take your seam ripper and open up the seam. To finish the bottom of the bodice, we are going to take our binding tape and pin it on right sides to right sides all the way around. When you get to the elastic bit, you're going to want to stretch that out while you pin your bias binding in place. Otherwise, this won't stretch anymore. Once you've stitched your bias tape on, it's a good idea to trim the seam allowance in these corners. Like I cut off the extra zipper tape that was up above the stitching line here, and then we are going to cover our seam. So we want to fold this down and fold it under like that, pin it, and stitch it with this folded all the way around. Once it's pinned all the way around, you just want to double check here where the zipper is that your tape is pinned evenly here. It's really easy to get one a little bit higher than the other. So now we're just going to stitch it down so that you catch this edge all the way around. Once you're done binding around the bottom of the bodice, then do the same thing for the armhole. Once you stitch it around, we're going to do the same thing where we fold the bias binding in and then fold it down and then stitch that all the way around like that. Before we bind the neck hole, what we're going to do is put a little loop, elastic loop for the keyhole opening. So I'm basically just tying this almost like as small as I can. I'll probably have to trim off some extra after. So just stitch that in place facing this way, because once we put the binding on, it will end up in that direction. Once your loop is secured in place, we're going to apply binding all the way around the neck hole. So just like we did before, and be careful around the corners. Press all of your binding. Once your binding is on and pressed, we're going to sew just a small button. It can almost be any kind of button as long as it's small, on the back on the right side of the keyhole.